first step towards fixing a problem is acknowledging the presence of the problem. And that is exactly what Deng Xiaoping did when he took over as the new leader of China in 1978. He had seen the decades of impoverishment that the Chinese had undergone under the cult leadership of his predecessor. So he was committed to making the country prosperous. But that in itself was a challenging task, owing partly to the size of the country, both with respect to the area and the population. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are looking at China and the factors and the leadership that brought about the economic miracle starting in the late 20th century. Now, Deng Xiaoping was a very capable politician and a very efficient manager. And Mao Zedong recognized this very early. As the first generation got old or died due to being purged or old age, Mao put Deng in charge. Deng then butted heads with Mao and was purged again. But by then, Mao himself was near the end of his life, and people started siding with Deng Xiaoping in private. So when Mao died in 1976, most of the first generation leadership had died, and the second generation put Deng Xiaoping in charge of the communist government in China. Now, how did Deng Xiaoping figure out that the policies instituted by Mao Zedong had really failed the Chinese? It was actually very easy. All you had to do is look over the ocean and you saw Hong Kong and Taiwan both prospering. And since both these regions had close social and cultural ties with mainland China, Deng Xiaoping realized that there was no reason they could not replicate the same economic prosperity in the People's Republic of China. So on December 18, 1978, in front of about 200 delegates from the Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping laid out the key tenets of the strategy that would be followed in the future to get China on the path of economic prosperity. Now, a lot of those present were still under Mao's shadow. And Deng Xiaoping started by saying that ideology needed to be rejected and science and technology needed to be embraced, and the markets needed to be opened to change the backward condition of the country. Deng concluded that the time had come to liberate our minds. The Mao Brigade was shocked, but the liberals were super excited. And now came the difficult part, the implementation. Interestingly, Deng Xiaoping adopted what most of the businesses have adopted worldwide, the agile methodology. In other words, local experimentation in limited areas, and as these deliver results, expanding the reach to other regions of the country. So this essentially meant that Deng Xiaoping was getting rid of the central command economy and empowering the local economy. This also meant that the movement towards a market economy would be more gradual and evolutionary, so that the cost of adjustment could be limited. Now, it is possible that if the Soviet Union had followed the same model, the collapse may have been avoided. And when it came to sectors, Deng Xiaoping picked agriculture to be the first sector to be liberalized. So the reform basically consisted of a decollectivization and allowing produce to be sold in free markets at market-determined prices. And once again, following the cautious and contained approach, the freeing up of markets was first allowed in secondary crops and finally in food grains. The commune land, which had been modeled on Stalin's model of collectivization in the Soviet Union, was finally divided into smaller plots, which were allocated to individual households. They were allowed to keep all the income from the land after paying the stipulated taxes. And this immediately provided incentives to increase production and income. The grain output increased on an average annual rate to 5% between 1978 through 1984. And when productivity increased, that meant the entire population of China did not need to be in the countryside farming. What are dictators most afraid of? Education and educated citizens. So in August of 1966, when Mao Zedong started the Cultural Revolution, the first area of impact was that the nation's schools were shut down so that the youth could be sent to the countryside. So for the next decade, higher education was a dream for most of China's population. And then, in December of 1977, when Deng Xiaoping was still the Minister for Education and Science, examinations were suddenly announced to all Chinese for seeking entry into the universities. The basic infrastructure requirement to turn around the economy had just been kickstarted. The best way to defeat a lie is to expose the truth. And along those lines, Deng Xiaoping sent a delegation on a fact-finding mission led by the Deputy Prime Minister to Europe. Between May and June of 1978, the delegation visited France, West Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and Denmark. And when they returned, they reported that whatever they had been told earlier was grossly off. The West had made great strides in the fields of science, technology, and economics, whereas China was far, far behind. Deng Xiaoping himself visited Singapore and Japan and took with himself the national TV filming crew to film firsthand the way the ordinary Singaporean or Japanese worker lived. And when the film was played back in China, the Chinese were astonished to see that ordinary factory workers in Japan and Singapore had refrigerators in their houses. So in one masterstroke, Deng Xiaoping dispelled the lies that had been fed to the Chinese public during Mao's reign, and at the same time energized the general population to work towards achieving what others had already achieved. Deng Xiaoping realized that to achieve his dream of economic progress in China, he needed help. And that meant reaching out to the United States. Much is made of President Richard Nixon's visit to China in February of 1972. Though it established a diplomatic channel between United States and China, but with Mao Zedong still in power, there wasn't much beyond that happened. It was on New Year's Day in 1979 that President Jimmy Carter formally established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, or mainland China, and in mid-January, Deng Xiaoping paid an official visit to the United States. The primary aim was to seek help from the United States with respect to building a science and technology infrastructure in China. After returning from the US, Deng Xiaoping visited southern China to kickstart the initiative towards economic liberalization on the industrial front. And the area identified was the Pearl River Delta overlooking Hong Kong. the Pearl River flowed into the South China Sea, and from Guangzhou, you could look across and see Hong Kong and witness the prosperity firsthand. So, to liberate the economy, Deng Xiaoping did not go about dismantling all the state enterprises. Instead, he preferred the agile approach. Experiment locally, and if the experiment is successful, then expand it to other regions of China. So, 4 experimental zones, Xiamen, Shantou, Shenzhen, and Zhuhai, were set up along the Pearl River Delta to free up the local economy and attract foreign investment. These zones were called the Special Economic Zones, or the SEZs. And one of the first proposals coming out of the SEZs was the creation of a breaker's yard that would dismantle old Chinese merchant ships and sell the scrap metal to Hong Kong, where there was a huge demand. Now, Hong Kong did not have space for such a venture, so it readily welcomed it. And on the 31st of January, 1979, the first foreign investment contract was signed. And this was just the beginning. Hong Kong, which was still a territory of the British, took full advantage of the SEZs because they offered cheap labor and close proximity, and it started moving a lot of its manufacturing facilities into the SEZs. And once this experiment was successful, the business environment in other regions across China was opened up to local and foreign investment. So as foreign investment started coming in, the government started investing heavily in infrastructure. But having a central decision-making system or authority was not going to be scalable as far as the pace of change was concerned. So as the economy started growing, the management had to be localized. And that meant the country needed more trained managers. And right on cue, Deng Xiaoping requested Jimmy Carter to open up the US universities to students from China. The Chinese leadership was concerned that sending students abroad would create more brain drain, so very few would return. But Deng Xiaoping's response was that even if 1 out of 10 returned, that itself would be a victory for the country. The results were glaringly obvious. China achieved nearly 10% average growth rate of GDP over the 2 decades beginning 1978. Also, from 1978 to 1995, 20 Chinese provinces had per capita growth rates higher than any other country in the world. And foreign direct investment, it jumped from near zero in 1978 to more than $45 billion in 1997. So what were the key factors that led to this phenomenal growth and China becoming an economic superpower? One of the most important factors was actually geography, specifically China's proximity to Hong Kong and Taiwan, which at that time were booming economies. The initial boom was actually facilitated by the relocation of labor-intensive stages of production from Hong Kong and Taiwan to the adjacent SEZs, or the special economic zones, in the coastal provinces of China. The political risk too was very low because at some point in time, Hong Kong was going to become a part of China. The second most important factor was the abundance of labor. China as a country is huge, and so is its population. But more important than that, China had an abundance of cheap and disciplined labor. So labor unions were officially allowed, but they mostly played a cooperative role with the management instead of a collective bargaining one. And in the SEZs, managers were given the right to hire and fire workers at their discretion. Many of the workers were temporary migrants coming from the rural areas. And since the rural areas already had a huge surplus of labor in the agriculture sector, this also ensured that even a large-scale shifting of labor to manufacturing would not create any significant pressure for wage increases. However, the most important factor that contributed to high foreign direct investment in China was the macroeconomic stability that existed. And ironically, the presence of an authoritarian regime was the primary reason the macroeconomic stability existed. Businesses love politically stable economies, and authoritarian regimes tend to provide more stability than many democratic regimes, especially in the third world. However, there are a lot of lessons to be learned by other emerging economies from China. And the most important is the gradual imposition of reforms. The gradual imposition of the reforms is one of the factors that differentiates China from the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union could have avoided an economic collapse if it had taken a few pages from the China playbook. But what made China an economic superpower? Many economies at different points in time have opened up and have had a high influx of foreign direct investment. They become prosperous, but not economic superpowers. Well, population is a huge contributing factor. So China has been able to become a manufacturing and shipping hub for the world, but at the same time, its massive population has also become richer and as a result also become an important center of consumption. And when an economy of this size becomes one of the top consumers in the world, it also begins to influence demand. So the global businesses can no longer cater just to the Western markets. But leaving the consumer economy aside, there is one major factor that is contributing to China becoming a huge economic superpower and a global player. And that is the innovation it has initiated in the field of science and technology on its own. And that means it can now compete with the science and technology superpowers like the United States, Germany, etc., for major projects across the globe. And because of this economic power, it can in turn increase its political influence. And this is most evident in China's Belt and Road Initiative, also known as China's Marshall Plan. The Belt and Road Initiative is a grand plan to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through a belt of overland corridors and a maritime road of shipping lanes. Across Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa, the Belt and Road includes 71 countries that account for half of the world's population and a quarter of the global GDP. And this also means that Chinese firms are engaging in construction work across the globe on an unparalleled scale. And to date, Chinese companies have secured more than $340 billion in construction contracts along the Belt and Road. So to summarize, a pragmatic and a brilliant leader came to power in China. He decided to open up the economy, but gradually, starting with small economic zones in the southern part of the country to attract investment from the neighboring economies like Hong Kong and Taiwan. This led to the country spending a lot of money building infrastructure, which included industrial and academic infrastructure. As the economic zones expanded to more regions across the country, having 6% of the world land mass and about 1/5 of the world population helped it become the manufacturing and industrial hub of the entire globe. It continued to educate its massive pool of resources in science and technology, and through a combination of reverse engineering and research, it slowly became self-sufficient enough to compete with its own customers on the global front. And with all the advantages that China holds today, competing with China is going to be a tall order. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. A miserable rock 230 miles off the coast of a nation was a major point of tension between two nations during the Cold War. Rockall is a 100 feet wide and uninhabitable rock 230 miles off the coast of Scotland. During the Cold War, it was a major point of tension between Great Britain and the neighboring Ireland. Britain feared that it could be used to spy on a missile testing base in Scotland, and subsequently the United Kingdom sent a Royal Navy team out in 1955 to plant a flag, install a plaque, and officially claim the 70 feet high rock as British territory. Almost 70 years later, Britain and Ireland are still fighting over Rockall and the fishing rights surrounding it. So the answer is A. Great Britain and Ireland are the two countries which found the rock to be a major point of tension between them. Question for the current episode. Who are the top 3 trading partners of China? Is it A. United States, Japan, and Vietnam? B. United States, Hong Kong, and Japan? C. Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam? Or D. United States, Germany, and India? Once again, who are the top 3 trading partners of China? A. The US, Japan, and Vietnam? B. The US, Hong Kong, and Japan? C. Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam? Or D. The US, Germany, and India? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at one of the most path-breaking events of the 18th century with respect to technology and trade and commerce. We look at the Industrial Revolution and the factors that combined to trigger it and the impact it had on the social, economic, and political setup across the globe. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.